As we move into the second part of our textbook, we start focusing on what your textbook refers to as key themes. And so these first few chapters that we'll be going over in this module, as well as in the upcoming two more modules, um, they deal with what we sometimes call as social determinants of health, which is kind of just maybe a fancy way of saying that one determinant of health seems to be social demographic characteristics like social class and race and gender and sexuality and age. So we're going to be going through some material related to the background of those concepts and then specifically how it applies to health. In all of the chapters, there will probably be a good deal of background material that is meant to provide you context to the textbook material. So you want to make sure that you are not just reading the chapter, but then that you also are listening to the video, going over the lecture notes, and taking good slides. So we begin with chapter 5, which is about inequality in health. And so the big question when we're thinking about social determinants of health is, does our health vary based on who we are? And so this is just a graph that is asking people to rank their own health as excellent or very good, good or fair or poor. And it seems that there is a relationship between having a higher education and having at least the self-perception that you are in good health. So let's talk through some of these concepts and the research behind why there might be a relationship between social class and health. And we'll come back to what extent might this perception that if you are a person of higher education, you might be in better health than someone who is not. So this chapter is going to begin with me just introducing some terms. And if you're a sociology major, these are probably terms and ideas that you know. So this will be old material. If you aren't a sociology major, or you've only taken intro sociology and it was years ago, then this might be a helpful primer on some important terms that are relevant to this chapter's material. So beginning with inequality, in particular, when we're talking about social inequality, we're basically just saying that there exists in society a disparity in the income, wealth, power, prestige, and other resources. Everyone doesn't have the same amount of what I like to call the good stuff. We have differing amounts of good stuff. It's not all equal. Now, social stratification, which sounds very similar, or at least begins with the same word, it is the systematic ranking of different groups of people in a hierarchy of inequality. So it's the idea that society somewhat stratifies us into a kind of ranking where some of us structurally have better access to the good stuff than others. So if you think about social stratification as a ladder, then there are those of us that are on the higher rungs that have better access to the good stuff than those of us on the bottom rungs. And now these stratification systems, these ladders, can be considered closed or open. A closed system doesn't allow for any mobility. You're born on the rung that you're born on, and you die on that same rung. There's very little that you can do to change your situation in life. An open system, there is mobility that allows people to move up as well as, fall down several rungs. And this system is usually based more on people's individual achievements and characteristics. And so the stratification system that we have in the US and that a lot of countries have at this point are what we call class systems. And so class system means that our strata are social classes, groups of people that have similar levels of resources and are believed to kind of share similar lifestyles. And so when I teach this, the social class system that I teach is the six class system. And you get a sense of what that six class system looks like right there. You have the capitalist system, sometimes called the 1% on the top. Then you have upper middle, lower middle, working poor, and underclass. A lot of the jobs that require not just a college education, but advanced degrees is upper middle. Lower middle can be people who both go to college, as well as people who maybe just have a trade or a small business, depending on how well the business is doing. Some business people are in upper middle, some people are lower middle. If you're Jeff Bezos, you're in the capitalist class. The working class usually have no college, and these are people like factory workers, clerical workers, retail sales. Working poor, people who work, but they work for minimum wage in a state where minimum wage is not a living wage. And then underclass are people who are either unemployed or underemployed, meaning they only work part-time, or in some cases, they're employed in off the market work, meaning that, they don't pay taxes and they don't report the income to the government. So, they look like they have a lot less than what they have. People who live off of government assistance also are in this class. So this is kind of what our class system looks like. And in our class system, there is mobility. We are a relatively open class system. There are things that you can do that can have you move up the ladder. Although it's worth noting that for a lot of people, reaching that top rung, the capitalist class, is really hard to reach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the distinction between income and wealth in a couple of slides. So your placement in that social class system is largely comprised of like four components. And the first of those, two of those components I just mentioned, and that's income and wealth. Income is the amount of money a person or a household earns in a given period of time. This would be like your job salary, money that comes in through investment, Social Security, if you receive any type of government payment like disability. One thing to know about income in America is that the median US household income, so what the 50% percentile makes, it has been decreasing. It was 63,535 in the year 2000. A decade later, it had declined by more than 12% to 55,640. Then, as we kind of started to rebound from the Great Recession, it increased every year since 2013, but at $61,937, which is what it was in 2018. It's worth noting we still haven't made it back to our 2000s, our beginning of the aughts numbers. And so wealth is not necessarily the money that you earn, but is the value of everything a person owns minus the value of everything owed. But not everything that you own is a wealth building asset. You need to think about assets that don't necessarily depreciate in value. And so this would be things like your home. If you have really fancy vehicles, I'm not talking about like my Honda Civic. I'm talking about like maybe if you've ever watched that TV show with Jerry Seinfeld, Coffee with Comedians and Cars, so if you have some Rolls Royces and other rare cars in your driveway, then vehicles will count. Your stocks and bonds and investments here, they double count as both assets as well as, income. The thing about wealth is, it's what I like to call mailbox money. And a lot of times it's not like you are having to actively work. You are not working a job in order to make that money. It's just kind of coming in. Your money makes money. And in this way, it can be built up over a lifetime, and then it can be passed down to future generations, in a way that, if someone's a doctor, they can't just pass their practice off to their child, unless their child is also a doctor. You can't give someone an occupation, but if someone owns, 5 McDonald's, that is income that they bring in their life, but it's also wealth, because that can be transferred, to family when they pass away. And so, just some points about how income and wealth inequality exist in the U.S. One way that we talk about income is we rank households by their annual income, and then we categorize them into quintiles, fifths. And so the one way we can talk about it is that the bottom quintile takes in just over 3% of the aggregate income, meaning that the bottom 20% makes about 3% of the nation's income, while those in the top quintile, the top 20%, they take in about half, so 50% of the income. Another way of thinking about that top 20% is that they bring in as much as all of the bottom 80% combined. And if we narrow it down to just the top 5%, they alone take in more than the bottom 40% combined. As unequal as this is, the distribution of wealth is even more unequal than the income gap, and it is also growing. So the share of household wealth owned by the top 0.1% has increased from 7 to 22%. And for the bottom 90% of families, because of rising debt and the collapsing value of their assets during the financial crisis, particularly their home, a lot of them have experienced the erosion of wealth. And this has been especially true for minority groups who already had fewer financial assets than whites. And this is true if you're referring to both non-Hispanic Blacks as well as Hispanic Latino households. If you prefer your facts in graph form, this graph pretty much just makes a pretty similar points, right? That for most of the 80% of the population, they have very little wealth. They have equity in their home, but that's only if they in fact own their home outright and don't have, it mortgaged to the hilt. While the top 1% has 43% of the wealth, and most of that's comprised of stocks and in businesses, majority shares, and a lot of top businesses. And then income inequality, you can see there, that's it shows you the bottom 4 quintiles and then the top 5%, and it's over time. So you can see that the bottom 2 quintiles have had very stagnant wages since 1967, while the 4th quintile and the 3rd quintile saw some growth during the early to late 90s before dipping a little right during those years of the recession. But then you can see that where we've seen the greatest income growth has been with the top 5%, who compared to what they made in 1967 now make 66% more. So our richest people are a good deal richer than the poor than what they were 5-6 decades ago. The other kind of the third component that I want you to consider is higher education or educational levels. So with education levels, it's worth noting that in the early years of the US, there was no free public education. So people had private tutors, or later they went to private schools, and most of these were costly. As we began to go through the industrialization period and less people made their living from farming, formal education began to be seen as being essential to the well-being of society. So you can steadily start to see the growth of high school graduates, kind of beginning in the 1920s, 1930s, and then increasing till now, of course. The expectation is that most people are going to graduate from high school, and our graduation rates, when including GED programs, is over 80%. And at the same time, especially beginning in the 1970s, you start to see a steady share of the population also graduating from college. And so now, of course, there is now not just the expectation that people are going to graduate from high school, but that they're going to go and graduate from college as well. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the other kind of components of social class, occupation and status, which are related to one another, are related or correlated with education status. So occupation is a person's main vocation or their paid employment. What do they get paid to do? And for most people, unless they're living off of investments, this is their main source of income. And so one way we distinguish between occupations is by collar. So blue collar is often manual labor, and this is working class work. Even though it's worth noting that for some specialized trades, in terms of the money that they make, it easily can place them into what we would consider to be lower middle, maybe even upper middle income levels. Part of the reason why we don't place them in the upper class, though, is because of the occupation that they are doing and its accompanying status. A lot of blue collar work, manual labor, trade, factory work, regardless of pay, is fairly low prestige. And prestige is associated with social position. Is how we describe what we call social status, right? So how highly someone thinks of you because of your social position. White collar, these are jobs that usually require formal education, and instead of relying on a person's hands, we say it relies on analytic skills, their brains. A lot of jobs that are white collar are higher prestige, but that isn't 100% the case. There's some jobs that, even though they pay a lot of money and they are a white collar occupation, they're still fairly lower prestige. We still usually consider these jobs, though, to be upper middle, lower middle class. So you see their jobs like stockbroker, accountant, real estate agents. When we look at the prestige scales, which is information that we collect from people on how they view different occupations in the US, these jobs tend to have lower than average prestige scores, while white collar jobs like doctors, scientists, nurses, teachers, they tend to have higher prestige scores. Now, there are some jobs like firefighters and military officers that don't really fit in with this blue collar, white collar type of distinction labeling. Those jobs also tend to be higher prestige. And that's because higher prestige jobs, most of them do involve working with ideas, but some of them also, teachers, firefighters, military officers, they involve providing services that contribute to the public. Now, the kind of feminized version of blue collar jobs are pink collar jobs, but oftentimes, unlike trade jobs, they're considered to be less skilled. So they're only semi-skilled, so they tend to be even lower paid. So these jobs are, if not working class, even more often working poor. So, jobs like waitress, hotel desk clerk, hotel maid, retail sales, all of those jobs are pink collar jobs, and they're referred to as being pink because they are predominantly held by women, usually women that lack a college degree. And so, when we take all those components together, we come up with, let me just go back to the ladder so you can remind yourself what that looks like. When we consider, your income and your occupation and your education level, and then, the status that we associate with your occupation, we place people in these social classes. But, there is this argument that in America, where we have a lot of mobility, particularly in those middle classes, working, lower middle, upper middle, and where we, because of credit cards, debt, and, buying cars, not having to pay for them outright, but, financing cars, financing our homes, there is this argument, do social classes really matter? Because yes, while we do have social inequality, it isn't clear that we have distinct lifestyles based on our resources. Um, and they're kind of, it says the poor, the one social class that definitively matters. And I should say here that, the other social class that we kind of definitively say is nothing like the rest of the classes are the 1%. The capitalist class, the upper class, upper class. And I'll talk a little bit more about them when we talk about global inequality. But, just kind of, thinking about a class that definitely kind of has a shared lifestyle, whose lives truly are shaped by their resources or lack thereof, then the poor, both the working poor and the underclass, are a good example of, a group that fits that bill. So one thing to clarify when we're talking about the poor is, who are we talking about? There are kind of three different ways to think about poverty. One way is if you think about the poor in terms of what's called absolute poverty, meaning you don't have enough to cover your basic needs. In our society, the best example of absolute poverty are the homeless, right? Because, they are frequently, they're without a home. They oftentimes don't have sufficient clothing, and they're going hungry in a lot of situations. Different from absolute poverty is the concept of relative poverty. You're poor for your area. You're poor compared to other people in your area. So you have enough to cover your basic needs. But, if you live in an area where everyone owns a car because there isn't mass transit, or there isn't reliable mass transit, and you don't have your own car, then that would be an example of relative poverty. One thing that I think this pandemic has kind of shined a light on is, to what extent we were taking it for granted that, everyone had in their home, in their possession, some type of a laptop or device like that with stable internet access in their home. One thing that schools have had to face is, what to do when you have students who don't have their own device and whose homes don't have the internet. And that's because lacking those things in today's society is a good example of relative poverty. No, it's not a basic need, but it is an important distinction between you and most everyone else in a given context. And then finally, we have official poverty, because we need to have some way of officially designating people as being poor in order to establish who is eligible and versus not eligible for government programs like, the SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, what we popularly call food stamps, who's is eligible for a Section 8, housing voucher, who's eligible when they're pregnant and or have young children for WIC, women, infants, children. So we have to have a way of designating eligibility. And so we've been using since the 1960s kind of this equation based on the cost of foodstuffs how much money you would need if a certain percentage of your income was supposed to go to food in order to buy the basics for a family of a certain size. And so using that equation, this is the guideline that we come up with. If you are a household of just one, 12,140. If you're two, 16,460. If you're three, 20,780. And most government and state programs, they'll say something like you need to be 100% of the poverty line, or they'll say you need to be 200% of the poverty line, in which case they're doubling it. And then they'll make oftentimes in a lot of states, especially if it's a cash payment, there are other criteria you then need to meet. But what's really important about official poverty, these official poverty numbers, is if you make even $20 more than what the cutoff is, you are in fact cut off. And this is what becomes a catch-22 for people at the bottom of the social class ladder. Is you really have to truly experience an improvement in your life in order to successfully move yourself off that ladder. And in some cases, if all you're receiving is like a 50-cent raise from your minimum wage job, all that 50-cent raise might cost you is your access to government programs that provide much needed housing and food and health insurance. And what it doesn't really mean is that, you making an extra, $400 a month isn't going to dramatically change your life. So this becomes kind of the complicated relationship. We have to have a way of establishing assistance. But, the moment we draw that line in the sand, it's going to create some moral conundrums. So who are the poor in the U.S.? Geography-wise, a lot of poverty in particular is kind of localized in the Deep South, places like Mississippi and Alabama, but also the Southwest. New Mexico is one of the poor states. And then even though the Northeast is largely has some of the wealthiest high-income states, places like Vermont, Connecticut, just a couple of states down, you have West Virginia, which is one of the lower income states as well. In terms of race, ethnicity, for most of the racial minority groups, they have higher rates of people being in poverty than white Europeans. And so this is true for African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. The only group this isn't true for is Asian Americans. And that's just because, as we'll talk about in Chapter 7, for a lot of Asian Americans, they are an immigrant population more so than any other group, meaning a large percentage of their population are immigrants or children or children of recent immigrants here, and they immigrate on the basis of work and school visas, meaning that they are, as a population, more educated and better placed to have higher paying jobs compared to the populations that have a higher percentage of people just who have been in America for generations, and particularly the groups that have been disenfranchised in a systematic way. Now, it's worth noting that this is where you need to pay close attention to numbers, because while racial minorities have a higher percentage of their group who is poor, just because of the difference in sizes between the groups, that doesn't necessarily mean that they make up the bulk of people who are in poverty. So, what do I mean by that? While only 11% of white Americans are poor, 49% of the poor are white, and that's because about 64%, at least in 2010, of the population was white non-Hispanic. Now, it's worth noting that 49% versus 64% still means that white Americans are less likely to be poor than, for instance, Latinos, who at 24% of the poor, compared to the fact that they were 16% of the population in 2010, means that they are overrepresented. Same with African Americans, and same with even Native Americans, who make up only 2% of the US poor, but because they make up slightly less than even 1% of the population, like that's what I'm saying when I say that they are disproportionately represented. So, just be careful, when you are comparing rates versus real numbers, and make sure that you're understanding what the graphs are saying. Obviously, with poverty, in addition to race, there is a real education component. People who drop out of high school have a much higher likelihood of being poor than those who don't. Um, there also is a trend of what we call feminization of poverty, which is a fancy way of saying that female-headed households, regardless of race, have higher rates of poverty. And it probably has a lot to do with the fact that women who work make less than men who work, even when they have similar levels of education. And this is particularly true for women and men who have high school diplomas or less. The types of jobs available to women versus the types of jobs that are available and more often held by men, they differ greatly in terms of their pay. So female-headed households are more likely to be poor, and they're more female-headed households in the last, 4 or 5 decades than there were at previous points in the US history. And so we call this trend the feminization of poverty. So unsurprisingly, children in particular, because they have no real control over their income status, their household income, their child labor laws, so they can't contribute to the household income, by the luck of birth or the disluck of birth. You're born into a rich family, you're born into a poor family. And so America does have high child poverty rates. The states that you see in purple are the states where in 2010, 25% or more of the children who lived in that state were considered to be in poverty based on the official poverty line. So that just kind of shows you that child poverty is definitely an issue. And we're usually very concerned about child poverty just because of the strong propensity for people who are born and raised in poverty to be unable to escape it and grow up to be poor adults. Another age group that has strong poverty trends, although not as dire as they once were, are the elderly, and kind of for similar reasons. At some point, the elderly, they have to stop working, and if they haven't adequately saved, then they're now living on a fixed income, Social Security. And at best, if they don't have savings and they don't have family that's contributing to their care. Now, it's worth noting that Social Security has dramatically diminished the percentage of the elderly that we have in that are impoverished. It used to be, for instance, in 1970, 25%, 1 out of 4 of elderly people were in poverty, and now it's 10%. The kind of trade-off is, we have more children in poverty than what we used to have in the past. So that's kind of what our poverty levels look like. And so that is definitively a social class that matters. Now, in the same way that we can talk about individual differences in health and individual distinctions in social class and social inequality, we can also talk about it like on the population level. And if we're talking about health on the population level, then we refer to that as population health, like group level differences. So it's not so much your individual health, but the health of the group that you belong to. And that's what we're going to be doing as we get to, the meat of this presentation. In the same way, we can talk about social inequality at the population level, like how equal and unequal is a given society. And your book talks about, the measure that we often use to describe inequality on that larger level is the Gini coefficient, which, you don't have to worry about the equation because I can't explain it to you anyway, but just know how to read it. And, it's read like a proportion. If 0 is perfect equality and 1 is perfect inequality, 0.3 is a fairly equal society. 0.6 is a society that is fairly unequal. Anything that's over 0.6 is considered to be a pretty unequal society. And so this gives you a sense of, in terms of countries, globally, what does that look like in terms of the Gini coefficient? And America is coming in at 0.45, 0.49, the same as Mexico, but worse than our neighbors to the north, Canada, which is 0.3 to 0.34. But it's worth noting, better than a lot of the countries in South America, where it's 0.5, 0.55. A few countries are similar to America with the 0.45 to 0.49 levels. A lot of Europe, who we're comparing ourselves to a lot of the times, they have some low 0.25, 0.25 to 0.29, 0.3 to 0.34. They have much lower Gini coefficients. They have societies that are more equal or more egalitarian than ours. So, the fact that we have this information about a lot of the countries in the world, what are the takeaways concerning global inequality? And, this is from your book. They make the point that half the world's wealth is owned by the 1% of the population. And this amounts to $110 trillion, which is 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world's population. Another way to think about this is the bottom half of the world's population owns the exact same amount of wealth as the richest 85 people in the world. And your book really just encourages you to really think about that rich, that, who are we talking about when we're talking about, the 1% globally? These aren't even like the celebrities that you think of who are multimillionaires, but are not trillionaires. That is just an astronomical amount of wealth. They point out that 7 out of 10 people live in countries where economic inequality has increased in the last 30 years. And the United States is a country that is highlighted as being one of the more unequal in terms of the share of wealth that the richest 1% in our country have compared to the rest of the population. So, how does this inequality come about? So it's worth noting that your book focuses on international examples for countries in areas like the UK and Germany, and that's page 82. But, we're in America. So what about the US? So it's worth noting that, some of the kind of underlying causes behind, the increasing inequality in America are as follows. First of all, it's just the fact that, compared to a lot of other countries, America has always had very capitalist underpinnings. And capitalism, the very nature of capitalism, is going to contribute to growing inequality because of the focus on profits. And you're going to get a profit by, either charging more for your service or good, or paying, your employees lower wages or some combination of the two. And so, that's what we've seen. We've seen wages stagnate, and we've seen business owners, especially big business, enjoy greater profit margins. And part of why they've been able to do this to workers is because we've had the decline of unionization. Now, historically, this country has had skirmishes around unions, and on Labor Day. I mean, that is what we're celebrating, is the work of the labor movement in America, to get benefits, and protections for the average worker. But even in industries where unions have enjoyed kind of strength, and this is particularly true of factories, unions no longer have that same level of strength. And in factories, it has a lot to do with the fact that, with deindustrialization, a lot of those jobs went away, which meant that if you were able to hold on to your job, as the worker, you now no longer had a lot of, you didn't have a lot of power in that dynamic, because now there were a lot of people who could potentially replace you, and so it wasn't possible for them to mobilize and come to the table and negotiate, and strike if need be, because now those jobs were declining. And that does bring us to three. As we've had a decline in the manufacturing sector, those jobs have gone away, and they've been replaced by, for people who don't go to college, because there was job growth in analytic white collar industries, but those jobs required investment in higher education. So for people who didn't go to college, instead, a lot of job growth occurred in the service sector. And in the service sector, with lower pay scales, fewer benefits, and because they're less skilled, usually just kind of less opportunities for workers to successfully unionize. Those jobs haven't been great replacements for the manufacturing jobs. So, if you lost your factory job and you got a job at, your local grocery store, you took a real hit in terms of income and benefits. Yeah, another big difference between manufacturing jobs and service sector jobs is manufacturing jobs often had really good pensions, which helped when people retired. And now, of course, a lot of service sector jobs don't have those types of retirement benefits. And so people, are stuck working later and later in their life at these low paying jobs, or risking being one of those impoverished elderly people that I just discussed. The fourth thing is in America, and this is going to be discussed more thoroughly in chapter 7, is that we do have a legacy of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability. So this type of discrimination that happens in employment, it does still happen. But if it happens now, it has to fly under the radar, because there are protections, legal protections against this type of discrimination, and you can sue, and people do sue successfully. But those legal protections, I mean, we've only had those in place for the last 4 or 5 decades. And so that means historically we have had a legacy in this country of not allowing certain people, based on their ascribed characteristics, access to certain jobs, access to promotions, access to all the benefits and that come with holding that type of job. And so this has definitely contributed to both the pay gap that exists between different groups, and certainly the wealth gap. And then finally, the one that I want to emphasize, because it certainly was a contributor to the Great Recession, is that people with higher income and wealth use their political influence to generate policies favorable to their position. With Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that pretty much, took off almost most regulations in terms of the amount of money that can go to political candidates. You have rich people giving millions of dollars to a political candidate, which of course influences, votes and policies. And that can be really dire. And you don't have to look far in our history to see that that can be dire. Um, you know, the 1999 repeal of Glass-Steagall. And it's just worth noting that Glass-Steagall was created in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression, because literally they were like, this is what contributed to the Great Depression. The fact that banks could operate both from what's called retail banking from investment banking. Retail banking is the banking that banks do with customers, right? That they give out loans. You have your checking and savings accounts. That's retail banking. Investment banking, of course, is the stock market. So they were like, it's not a good idea for the same bank to be able to do both. And so they passed the Glass-Steagall Act. It was bipartisan, and it was in place in America for over 60 years. And then in 1999, largely due to political pressure, the administration at that time, which was the they repealed that Congress, that Republican Congress led Congress repealed Glass-Steagall. And the economy was doing good, so it's not like we saw immediate effects. But what it did allow was it allowed banks, retail banks, like your Wells Fargo's, to engage in hedge fund training. And so because they wanted more money to engage in this investment banking, they were like, we need to bring in more money. So part of how they did that was by granting more mortgages. And so in order to do that, they began to create these high interest mortgage loans, and give them to subprime borrowers. And they're called subprime borrowers because they had a much greater likelihood of not being able to pay their loan, and their loan oftentimes had their mortgage loan oftentimes had these really high interest rates. So they were paying this money that was really just going to the bank. It wasn't on their house. And so the mortgage lenders, like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that engaged in this. And so eventually it just became a bubble. And we call this the burst of the housing bubble. And a lot of it was because of this predatory lending that was linked to, banks wanting to have like this additional money in order to invest. And when the housing bubble burst, people lost their homes. And this sent our recession, and then this impacted banks. This sent our economy in a recession, into a tailspin. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people lost their homes. A lot of businesses went under. And it's just worth noting that, a lot of the biggest losers in this situation were low-income people, or people that were right on, that border of being, working class, lower middle class. And the Great Recession plunged people down the class ladder. So all of this is explaining, kind of the reasons behind the inequality in the US. So now let's turn our focus to discussion. What does this mean for health? So, your book introduces the Marmot hypothesis, or, his argument that comes out of his research, which is that only about 1/3 of our health is due to what we think of as traditional risk factors, things like our decisions about exercise and diet and smoking. And the rest of our health, our are 2/3 are influenced by social processes. But then he knows that even that 1/3 isn't purely down to personal choice. And that's because your book notes, what seems like a bad choice in terms of one's health is also conditioned by social reasons. So it also is influenced by kind of our social class. And so what we see is like a distinction in things like, for instance, life expectancy, where the more money you have in your household, the longer it is that you live. And you can imagine that some of that money is filtered through, what we sometimes consider these personal choices. If you have more money, you can afford a better diet. You can afford, a gym membership or even a personal training. If you're addicted to smoking or alcohol, you can afford, a treatment center or a cessation program. But then what do they mean by social processes? Well, it's also the fact that, you live in neighborhoods where green spaces are more available and there are more healthy grocery stores and healthy places to eat versus fast food. You live in areas that aren't plagued by crime and don't have a high level of environmental toxins. You're more likely to be surrounded by similar people who have similar levels of income and who are making these, good choices like you. So that's what it's meant when it's like even your personal choices have this social context. This is just another graph that just kind of shows that distinction in life expectancy and income. If we kind of switch our focus to like how something like education impacts health, people that are more highly educated oftentimes work occupations where there are built-in advantages in their work roles. One built-in advantage for a lot of so-called good jobs is the fact that health insurance is provided, and sometimes it's provided at little to no cost. And so this allows people to get regular checkups. For a long time, certainly before the Affordable Care Act, mental health, mental health, whether it was covered by your insurance or supplemental insurance, I mean, that was seen as being a real extra, a perk. And so that was something that, only people that had really good insurance received. Other advantages is that these types of white collar occupations oftentimes allow people greater autonomy. It has which people tend to enjoy more. It has less oppressive uh, structures in terms of supervisors and policies. I know for myself, not having the type of job where I actually have to log into a physical clock is just great. I mean, I remember working that type of job in high school and college and right after college part-time. And it was extremely stressful. Like when you would run into traffic or, would be running even like 2 minutes, behind schedule, like, am I going to make it in work on time or am I going to be 2 minutes late, which is, negligible. But if you have a job that has a policy around tardiness, this is the type of stressor that is built into low wage jobs that people that have white collar jobs are just less likely to have. Oftentimes they have greater social and psychological resources. So, they are usually more aware of psychological services. They're more likely to use them. They're less likely to work, 2 jobs or jobs that have crazy hours, which gives them the ability to build better social lives and spend more time with people outside of work in social relationships, and that's been shown to have an impact on health. And then they're more likely to engage in positive health behaviors, and at least some of that, for instance, smoking, seems to be influenced by the fact that they're more knowledgeable about the risk associated with those behaviors as well as the rewards of not engaging in those behaviors. And so that knowledge translates to them being less likely to engage in that behavior. Specifically, one thing about occupation, a term that comes up with occupation, when you think about indirect versus direct effects on health, is John Henryism. So there's some jobs that have a negative effect on your health because of the job itself. Like maybe the job is dangerous, like mining or deep sea fishing. Maybe the job exposes you to toxins. Maybe the job, exposes you to violence, like, you're a CO at a CO at a prison. Um, but then there are indirect effects on health, right? And that's where it's not really your job that is directly affecting your health, but it has an indirect effect on your health, maybe by causing you stress or making you feel like you need to work through aches and pains and not go to the doctor and not take sufficient days off. And this, what I just described, is uh, a state of mind called John Henryism. And while it's not limited to African American men who are in working class, usually blue collar, manual labor type jobs, it has been studied extensively in that subpopulation, and that's part of why it's called John Henryism, because it's based on the story of John Henry. And I give you a little clip if you want to know more about who John Henry is and what John Henryism is. But basically, the idea is that Black men, working class Black men who have these jobs that are hard on their bodies, and then they build up this mindset of ignoring their hurts, not taking them seriously, not feeling like they're a big deal, that it's not manly, to go to the doctor and complain. That this is what leads to chronic illnesses like hypertension and high blood pressure, and also to heart attacks and early mortality. Now, moving beyond how your personal choices exist within a social context, considering a little more closely just, the role that communities play in a person's health. Regardless of a person's level of personal income, how much, what resources are available in their community itself also matters. And we can see this by looking at, the fact that poor people in higher income communities oftentimes live longer than poor people in lower income communities. And if you think about why that is, it becomes pretty clear. Yes, they're still poor and there are disadvantages associated with their individual level poverty. But on the group level, living in a higher income area versus a lower income area results in differences in, environmental toxins and exposure to environmental toxins. Certainly, it factors in differences in crime, particularly violent crime rates. Oftentimes, the higher income areas have, as I already noted, better grocery stores. They're not food deserts, healthier places to eat. They're more likely to have sidewalks and street lights, which make things like walking and riding a bike safer and easier. They're even in a lot of places, if there's a area that's going to have bike lanes, it's going to be the higher income area, not the poorer area. So all of this kind of explains why it's not even just about your individual level of income, but the level of resources in your larger community. And a good example of what can happen when a community is not well off is like looking at the case of Flint, Michigan. And so, if you remember, the story of Flint, Michigan is still going on, that they have lead in their water. They have this toxic water, and that's a picture of Flint water versus Detroit water. And part of it has to do with the fact that it was discovered that the water source that they were using that they draw and disinfect water from the Flint River, and then they pipe it in to these different homes. But what they've discovered is that these pipes contain lead, and it's corrosive, so the lead gets in the water. And they knew that, but instead of fixing the pipes in Flint, all they did was, redirect water to Detroit, so that they were no longer getting, this corrosive, toxic water. And they largely did not care about the people of Flint, because they were lower income and they had even less political power. And so this just shows you how, like, a poor person is still poor if they're living in Detroit, but a poor person in Detroit is at least not drinking lead-filled water the way the people of Flint are. But at the same time, you don't want there to be too big of a gap in the level of resources in a given area. And this is what your book discusses in the section that they call the spirit level. And it comes from a Wilkinson and Pickett book that came out in 2010. The primary argument being that once a society goes beyond a certain material threshold, it's not about the absolute levels of income, but relative income. And the greater the amount of inequality between the richest and poorest sections of society, the worse the social problems. And the UK and the USA were prominently featured in the book as some of the worst examples of this relationship between high inequality and social problems. And that's compared to Nordic countries and Japan. And your textbook notes that this seems counterintuitive, that wealthy countries, you would think, would be less likely to have these problems, because wouldn't they have the money to fix them? But this is why your book is the book emphasized, it's about relative income, relative poverty. When there is a subset of the population that is doing significantly worse than another subset of the population, that it seems to make social problems worse as opposed to better. And the book focuses particularly on, the fact that a lot of this is related to psychosocial factors. In particular, they point out stress. And so just a little background about stress. When we say stress, we can be referring to several things. We can talk about, feeling anxiety, particularly if we are talking about a specific situation that's called a stressor. We can use the term stress to refer to emotions that result from such exposure to such situations. Or we also can use the term stress to refer to the bodily changes that occur in the response to these situations and emotions. And particularly, we call this the fight or flight response. And stress is linked to a variety of physical ailments, everything from anxiety, depression, to weight gain, to sleep problems, digestive problems, heart disease. And I give you a little image that kind of goes over some of the ways that stress impacts the body. And so that feeling, that fight or flight response, this exists in a lot of animals, right? We perceive a stressor and our body literally prepares. It goes through several processes in the brain, in terms of the hormones it releases, that prepares us for fight. I'm going to stay here and fight, or I'm going to flee. And particularly those hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, come into play here. And so what does this mean for your body? Well, it's worth noting that unlike animals who do a really good job of distinguishing, this is an immediate stressor, and the fight or flight response in their bodies, pretty much only results in short-term stress. Because of how human life has developed, we are constantly perceiving stressors. And so, our body doesn't adequately move through the fight or flight response, which, after we are prepared to fight or flight, our hormone levels are supposed to go back to, their normal levels once we perceive there's no longer a threat. But, what about if there's just stressor after stressor after stressor in our day? Now we stay in this prolonged fight or flight response, and we're experiencing this more prolonged stress. And the long-term stress response comes with a lot of negative consequences for the body. Things like retention of sodium and water by kidneys, increased blood volume and blood pressure, suppression of the immune system, right? Our bodies are not meant to be in prolonged fight or flight response. But why are some individuals more stressed than others? Well, this is where we start getting, to the what we know about the role of social inequality. Why the finding that societies that have high amounts of social inequality relative to each other have these larger social problems. Because whether we're studying rats or primates, what we have learned is that certainly from rats, that stress can change gene expression. And so this is epigenetic research, and it's pretty interesting. I give you a video clip that you can check out. But it's basically the idea that, yes, you're born with genes, but those genes can change through experience, and then you pass those newly changed genes on to your young. We see it with rats, and the argument is this is what we have with humans, that humans, for instance, people at the bottom of the social class ladder, as they're exposed to constant stressors, this changes their genetic expression. It makes them unhealthier, and then that they can epigenetically like pass this stress along, to their descendants. This argument is strengthened by our primate studies. And so, part of why we choose primates is they're a lot like humans, and they live in kind of organized clans that oftentimes have rank and hierarchy. And so what's been really interesting when we look at primates is that the role of rank and hierarchy and the fight or flight response. That the lower ranked primates stay in kind of continual fight or flight response. And this leads to them having shorter lifespans than than the primates who are higher up on the rank hierarchy. It's interesting. I used to show my class a video, and they always emphasized it really isn't even being about the alpha primate. If you are the one right behind the alpha, it's actually a good position to be in. You don't have to worry about people necessarily, or people. You don't have to worry about other apes, testing your position. But at the same time, you're not at the bottom of the hierarchy where you are regularly mistreated and shitted on. And in some cases, that's like literal, defecation as a way to show your lower rank in your sleeping area. You don't have to fight for food because you're not at the bottom of the hierarchy. It's a pretty good position. We also learn from primates that the role of social alliance and affiliation can lead to better health. That, by engaging in social alliances, by doing things like mutual grooming, that they can make each other feel better, that they can improve upon their health, that the types of apes that engage in those types of behaviors have longer lives. And this isn't surprising if you consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Physiological needs and safety needs are right there at the bottom. The idea is you need those before you can build upon anything else. And if you think about who in our social class ladder is most likely to not be getting those needs met, physiological safety and security, is those people that are in those bottom, who are in those bottom classes. Your author also posits some arguments by Twenge and Campbell on page 87 and 88. So some things for you to consider is, in some ways has American society become even worse, because not only have we become more unequal, but to what extent does this contribute to what those authors refer to as insecure egos and a narcissistic epidemic, which of course exacerbates a lot of the other social problems that we can see in a society. Now, as a counterexample about how equality can be good for your health, they talk about Roseto, Pennsylvania. And in the 1930s and 1950s, as a lot of the kind of surrounding towns around Roseto are not doing well because they're coming out of the recession, Roseto is doing really well. They're much healthier than the surrounding towns in terms of their heart health and other indicators like that. But as it turns out, and it wasn't because, people had more money. It wasn't that because, people were more likely to engage in health behaviors. It had to do with the fact that it was frowned upon in Roseto to, if you were higher income, to kind of rub that disparity in people's faces. It was the opposite of keeping up with the Joneses. Instead, they tried to focus on, making sure that everyone felt included and no one felt like they were lesser than. And it made all of them healthier. But in the 1960s, they said the focus in Roseto kind of shifted, and it started to be much more acceptable, to have these distinctions in income and wealth and resources, where if you could afford the fancy car, you drove the fancy car. If you could afford the backyard pool, you put the backyard pool in. And unsurprisingly, that amazing health of this town began to decline. It no longer was benefiting from this kind of social affiliation, social alliance buffer. And so, why? Marmot, a name we already heard from in this chapter, he talks about the role of disempowerment, that a person's, position in the hierarchy and how steep that hierarchy is really shapes their perception of how disempowered they are. And that this disempowerment can take several forms. It can be material disempowerment, it can be psychosocial disempowerment, or it can be political disempowerment. But a society that has people that are experiencing this disempowerment, it not only impacts that society's health, but it also impacts other social problems. And so that is it for this chapter 5. Because there is so much additional material that I added to this chapter, I strongly, strongly encourage you to go over this video more than once. Take good notes as you're going over it. I also, I think, did a pretty clearly highlighted, what you need to know from the textbook.